Her ex-husband laughed her out of court until she revealed she was a billionaire's secret heir. The courtroom air was thick with a suffocating contempt, and all of it was directed at Evelyn Vance. Her modest second-hand dress seemed to wilt under the weight of a dozen judgmental stares. Across from her, her ex-husband, Julian Thorne, sat smugly beside his new fiancée, a woman practically dripping with diamonds and disdain. They were there to finalize a divorce, but for them, this was a coronation. Their plan was to methodically paint Evelyn as a worthless, parasitic spouse who deserved absolutely nothing. Julian's lawyer was a predator, circling his prey, ready to tear her to shreds before the judge. What could be more debasing than to be publicly annihilated by the very man with whom you once vowed to build a life? They believed they knew every detail about the quiet, timid woman they were so eager to discard. They were about to discover just how catastrophically mistaken they were. The sterile chill of courtroom 4B seemed to seep into Evelyn Vance's very bones. It was a coldness, born not from the building's overzealous air conditioning, but from the palpable scorn aimed directly at her. She sat alone, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles formed white peaks in a pale, trembling landscape. Her attorney, a young and sincere but visibly overwhelmed public defender named Sarah Jenkins, nervously shuffled papers beside her, the sound echoing in the tense silence. Across the aisle sat the architect of her current agony. Julian Thorne, her soon-to-be ex-husband, looked every inch the titan of industry she had helped create, his suit a custom-tailored Tom Ford. Its deep charcoal fabric was a stark symbol of a world from which she was now brutally excluded. At his side, his fiancée, Isabella Sterling, was a masterpiece of condescending perfection. Her blonde hair was swept into a severe, elegant chignon. Her pearl earrings gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and a smug smirk danced on her lips as she periodically leaned in to whisper into Julian's ear. They appeared as a power couple torn from the cover of a glossy business magazine. Evelyn, in her $15 thrift store dress, felt like a forgotten ghost haunting the scene of their triumph. "Your Honor," began Marcus Finch, Julian's lawyer. He was a man whose expensive cologne announced his arrival, a slick, silver-haired predator with a voice as smooth and treacherous as black ice. "We are convened today to dissolve the marriage between my client, Mr. Julian Thorne, and the respondent, Ms. Evelyn Vance," he purred. "But more pointedly, we are here to address Ms. Vance's completely unfounded and, frankly, insulting claim for spousal support." Finch paced before the judge's bench, his movements a masterclass in theatrical confidence. "Mr. Thorne, through sheer genius and relentless dedication, has erected a highly successful boutique investment firm, Thorne Capital. He is a pillar of the financial community. Ms. Vance, on the other hand," he paused, turning to gesture dismissively toward Evelyn, "contributed absolutely nothing. During the 5 years of their marriage, she drifted between a series of menial, part-time jobs. A barista here, a bookstore clerk there, never demonstrating a shred of ambition or drive. She was, to be blunt, a domestic anchor chained to a man destined for the stratosphere." Evelyn flinched as if he had physically struck her. A domestic anchor, was that all she was? She remembered the endless nights she worked double shifts at a diner, the smell of grease clinging to her hair so Julian could afford his subscriptions to the Wall Street Journal and the data terminals he insisted he needed. She remembered selling her late mother's locket, the only piece of genuine jewelry she had ever owned, just to cover the deposit on his very first office space. He had called her his angel investor back then, kissing her hands and promising her the entire world. "Furthermore," Finch continued, his voice dripping with false pity, "Ms. Vance has made zero effort to become self-sufficient since their separation 6 months ago. She resides in a dilapidated apartment, works minimal hours at a local library, and seems to believe my client, a man she emotionally abandoned years ago, should fund her unambitious existence indefinitely. It is not merely unreasonable, Your Honor. It is parasitic." Isabella Sterling let out a soft, delicate scoff, a sound engineered to be just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. She glanced at Julian, but he refused to meet her gaze, staring instead at the judge with a look of pained sincerity. He was playing the part of the victim, the benevolent genius held captive by a simple, grasping woman. "We have bank statements and employment records," Finch declared, slapping a thick folder onto the clerk's desk. They will illustrate a woman perfectly content with mediocrity, while my client was building an empire. To award her alimony would be to reward indolence. We propose a one-time settlement of $5,000, a generous offer to help her get on her feet, and not a penny more. $5,000. For 5 years of her life, for sacrificing her own aspirations, for believing in his. A bitter laugh nearly escaped Evelyn's lips. It was less than the pace of the watch glittering on Isabella's wrist. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Miller, peered down at Evelyn over her spectacles. Ms. Vance, your lawyer's initial filing requested 50% of all assets acquired during the marriage and ongoing alimony of $10,000 a month. Finch presents a starkly different account of your contributions. Do you have a response? Evelyn's throat felt as if it were packed with sand. Every eye in the room was fixed on her. She could feel the crushing weight of their collective judgment, their conviction that she was exactly the person Finch had described, a pathetic failure clinging to the coattails of a successful man. Your Honor, Sarah Jenkins began, her voice trembling slightly. My client supported Mr. Thorne emotionally and financially in the early years. Her income, while modest, covered their living expenses, while Mr. Thorne's business was nothing more than a concept. Finch let out a short, barking laugh. Objection, Your Honor, vague and unsubstantiated. Does she have receipts for the groceries she purchased? A detailed ledger for every cup of coffee? This is the desperate grasping of a woman who finally comprehends she let a winning lottery ticket slip through her fingers. The small gallery, composed mostly of Julian and Isabella's sycophantic friends, tittered with amusement. Julian finally risked a glance at Evelyn, his expression a toxic blend of pity and annoyance. It was the look one gives a stray animal you must shoo away from your immaculate porch. That single look, more than any venomous word Finch had uttered, shattered something deep inside Evelyn. The dam of quiet suffering she had painstakingly maintained for months finally broke. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, the cold courtroom air a shock to her system. The fear and shame that had held her paralyzed began to dissolve, replaced by a slow-burning, diamond-hard resolve. They wanted to scrutinize her finances. They wanted to debate what she was owed. Fine. The time had come to stop playing by their rules. She leaned over and whispered something into her lawyer's ear. Sarah Jenkins's eyes widened, first in shock, then confusion, and finally in a dawning, electrifying comprehension. She straightened her spine, her entire demeanor transforming from that of a nervous rookie into a poised professional. Your Honor, Sarah announced, her voice now clear and powerful, slicing through the murmurs in the room. We withdraw our previous request. It is, as Mr. Finch so crudely pointed out, inadequate. Finch smirked, sensing victory. Finally, a glimmer of sense. So you will be accepting my client's generous offer? No, Sarah replied, fixing him with an icy stare. We will be filing a new motion, a motion to dismiss the need for any spousal support whatsoever. My client has no need for Mr. Thorne's money. However, we will be seeking reimbursement for a number of personal assets that were left in the marital home. She paused, allowing the statement to hang in the electrified air. Assets valued conservatively at approximately $25 million. The courtroom plunged into a stunned, absolute silence. Marcus Finch's smirk evaporated, replaced by a slack-jawed gape. Julian and Isabella could only stare, their faces perfect masks of pure, unadulterated disbelief. $25 million. From the woman in the cheap dress, the rules of the game had just been rewritten, and Evelyn Vance was, at long last, ready to play. The memory was so sharp it felt like it had happened only yesterday. It was raining, a relentless New York City downpour that turned the streets into dark, glistening mirrors. They were huddled in their tiny fourth-floor walk-up apartment in Brooklyn, the one with the perpetually rattling radiator and the window that never quite sealed shut. Evelyn had just returned home from a 12-hour shift at the Daily Grind, a coffee shop where she was the star barista, her hands aching and smelling faintly of burnt espresso. Julian was hunched over their rickety dining table, which was buried beneath a mountain of papers, his face lit by the eerie glow of his laptop screen. He hadn't even registered her arrival. That was typical in those days. His mind was always a million miles away, lost in the complex universe of algorithms, market fluctuations, and financial forecasts. Jules, she had said gently, placing a paper bag on the one clear corner of the table. I brought you a sandwich, the pastrami one you like. He glanced up, his eyes unfocused for a second before recognition flickered. Oh, Ellie, hey, I didn't hear you come in. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. I think I'm onto something huge. A predictive algorithm for microcap stocks. It's revolutionary. She had smiled, her own exhaustion momentarily vanishing in the warmth of his infectious passion. This was the Julian she had fallen in love with, the brilliant, driven dreamer who could perceive patterns in the world's chaos that nobody else could see. He wasn't Julian Thorne, the future CEO back then. He was just Jules, the boy with a dream that was far too big for their tiny apartment. That's amazing, she had said, unwrapping the sandwich for him. But you need to eat something. You've been at this for 2 days straight. He took a bite, chewing distractedly. The server costs are going to be insane to backtest this properly, and I need a Bloomberg terminal subscription. That's $2,000 a month, Ellie. $2,000, he sighed, the immense weight of his ambition pressing down on him. It's impossible. Evelyn glanced around their small apartment. Every piece of furniture was secondhand, every plate and bowl was chipped. Her clothes were all from clearance racks. Her one indulgence, a new paperback book each month. All of their money, every spare dollar from her barista job and his sporadic freelance coding projects, was funneled into a savings account they had labeled The Dream. But it was never enough. The very next day, she took the subway to a small, dusty pawn shop in the Diamond District. Tucked inside her pocket was a small velvet box. Within it lay a delicate gold locket, intricately carved with forget-me-nots. It was a treasured gift from her mother, given to her on her 16th birthday, and the most precious thing she owned, a tangible link to a past she never spoke of. An hour later, she walked out of the pawn shop with $2,500 in cash, enough for his subscription fee and a little extra. When she presented the money to Julian that night, he was overcome with joy. Ellie, how? Where did you get this? I have my ways, she replied with a light-hearted smile, burying the memory of the gruff pawnbroker in the deep ache in her heart. Consider me your angel investor. He swept her off her feet, spinning her around their cramped living room. When Thorne Capital becomes a reality, I'll buy you 1,000 lockets. I'll buy you a diamond for every single coffee you've ever served. I promise, Ellie, this is all for us. For us. That had been their guiding principle, the justification for the sacrifices that piled up, each one a brick laid in the foundation of his towering success. She took on extra shifts, working as a waitress at night and after her day job as a barista. She learned to mend his suits and to create gourmet-style meals on a shoestring budget for the potential investors he paraded through their home. She was his confidant, his biggest cheerleader, his unpaid assistant, the silent, unwavering engine that powered his life while he chased his singular dream. The day Thorne Capital secured its first major round of funding felt like the greatest day of their lives. He came home, lifted her into the air in that same exultant way, and they celebrated by drinking expensive champagne from their mismatched coffee mugs. The future seemed boundless. But Evelyn soon learned that success was a corrosive acid. The more successful Julian became, the more their us began to feel like just him. Their tiny apartment was exchanged for a sleek, sterile condo with a view of Central Park. Her second-hand clothes were replaced by designer outfits he personally selected, insisting that she needed to look the part. The brilliant, impassioned dreamer she fell in love with was slowly being erased, replaced by a polished, calculating stranger. He started to criticize her for her lack of a prestigious degree, for her simple hobbies of reading and gardening on their small balcony, for her friends who were nurses and teachers instead of hedge fund managers and socialites. Ellie, you're not even trying, he would sigh in frustration after a networking event where she had spent most of her time talking with the catering staff. These people are important. You need to engage. She did try, but she felt like an imposter in that glittering world of hollow smiles and transactional conversations. It simply wasn't who she was. The more he pushed her to become someone else, the further she retreated into herself. And then Isabella Sterling appeared. Her father ran an older competing firm, making a union between Julian and Isabella far more than just a marriage. It was a merger. Evelyn first saw them together in a society column photograph. Julian's arm was wrapped around Isabella's waist at a charity gala he had claimed he was attending with his lawyer. He looked happy. He looked like he belonged. The final confrontation was cold and clinical, taking place not in their home, but in a neutral, sterile coffee shop. A cruel irony that was not lost on Evelyn. "This isn't working, Evelyn," he stated, refusing to meet her eyes while stirring a sugar packet he never used into his black coffee. "We want different things. I've outgrown this. We've outgrown this." "You mean you found someone more useful?" she asked, her voice quiet and steady, devoid of the tears he was so clearly braced for. His eyes flickered with irritation. "That's a crude way to put it. Isabella understands my world. She's part of it. You were for the beginning. I'll always be grateful for that. But this is the big leagues now." He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a separation agreement with insulting terms, effectively erasing her, reducing 5 years of her life to a mere footnote. "I'll be generous," he had said, the words landing like a slap across her face. "I won't let you become destitute." Looking back from the cold, harsh reality of the courtroom, Evelyn finally understood. He hadn't just wanted a divorce. He wanted to retroactively nullify their entire history. He needed the narrative that he had done it all himself, that she was nothing more than a temporary phase, a piece of scaffolding to be kicked away once his skyscraper was complete. By portraying her as a lazy, unambitious parasite, he wasn't just attempting to save money. He was attempting to save his own story, rewriting it to cast himself as the solitary hero. And for that lie to hold, he needed to humiliate her. He needed to make her feel small so that he could feel big. The silence in courtroom 4B was a physical presence pressing in on them, thick and suffocating. Marcus Finch's face, normally a mask of smug composure, had cycled through confusion and disbelief before finally settling on pure fury. $25 million? Finch sputtered, turning to the judge as if seeking an ally. "Your Honor, this is absurd. It's a desperate, ludicrous tactic." What assets could she possibly be referring to? A collection of used books and chipped coffee mugs? Judge Miller, however, was no longer looking at Finch. Her gaze was now fixed upon Sarah Jenkins, and for the first time that day, a flicker of genuine interest ignited in her weary eyes. "Ms. Jenkins," the judge said, her voice dangerously level, "you have made an extraordinary claim. I trust you are prepared to substantiate it. This court does not appreciate theatrics." "We are, Your Honor," Sarah said, her newfound confidence radiating from her. She opened a thin file folder, one that had been sitting on her desk ignored all morning. "During their marriage, Mr. Thorne and my client resided at 113 Central Park West, apartment 14A. When my client vacated the premises following their separation, she left behind several personal items she was unable to transport at the time." She slid a document across the table. "This is a preliminary inventory. The first item is a painting that was hung in the main living area. It is a piece by Jean-Michel Basquiat, titled Untitled Cadmium." A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. Even Julian appeared confused, his brow furrowed. He glanced at Isabella, who merely shrugged with a look of bored annoyance. Finch let out a contemptuous snort. "A Basquiat? Your Honor, they had a print, a poster they bought online for $50 and had framed. Is this some kind of joke?" "My client is not referring to a print," Sarah stated calmly. "She is referring to the original 1984 acrylic and oil stick on canvas. It was a gift to my client on her 18th birthday." Julian laughed out loud this time. "That's insane. Evelyn owns a Basquiat? Her father was a high school history teacher and her mother was a librarian. They lived in a suburb in Ohio. Where would she possibly get a multi-million-dollar painting?" He turned to the judge, spreading his hands in a gesture of complete bewilderment. "Your Honor, you see what I'm dealing with? She's delusional." Evelyn watched him, her expression unreadable. She let him talk. She let him dig his own grave. He was so utterly convinced of the narrative he had constructed about her simple, unremarkable past that he was blind to the truth as it began to materialize right before his eyes. The second item, Sarah continued, undeterred, is a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime watch, reference 6300G. It was kept in a safe in the master bedroom closet. Mr. Thorne was aware of the safe, though he was never provided with the combination. Julian's face turned ashen. He remembered the safe. It had been installed when they first moved in. Evelyn had told him it was for sentimental documents. He had found it peculiar but had been too consumed with the firm to ever question it. He had just assumed it contained old family photos and letters. A Patek Philippe, the most complicated and expensive wristwatch on the planet. He felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. And the third item, Sarah announced, her voice dropping for dramatic effect, is a set of bearer bonds issued by the United States Treasury with a face value of $10 million. They were stored in the same safe. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Finch was on his feet shouting, "Your Honor, this is a fabrication, a complete fantasy. She's inventing a treasure chest to extort my client. We demand proof, provenance documentation." "We have it," Sarah said simply. She produced another document. "This is a notarized statement from the executor of my client's family estate, along with insurance authentications for the specified items, all under the name Evelyn Vance Blackwood." The name landed in the room like a grenade. Blackwood. It was not a common name, but in the elite circles where Julian and Isabella now moved, it was a name spoken with the reverence typically reserved for royalty or deities. It was the name of Blackwood Industries, the reclusive multinational conglomerate with holdings in everything from global shipping and aerospace to rare earth minerals. It was a name synonymous with old money, immense power, and impenetrable privacy. Isabella Sterling gasped, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes, wide with shock, darted from Sarah to Evelyn. She was finally looking at Evelyn, truly seeing her for the very first time. The plain dress, the quiet disposition, it all suddenly seemed like a costume, a masterful disguise. Julian stood frozen, his mind racing, desperately trying to connect the dots. Blackwood. Evelyn Vance Blackwood. He remembered her mentioning her father, how they were estranged. She had described him as a difficult man who disapproved of her life choices. Julian had pictured a stubborn, small-town teacher who wanted his daughter to marry a local boy, not a brilliant financier. He had never once bothered to ask for her father's name. It had seemed so unimportant, a relic from a past he believed they had both left far behind. "Blackwood?" Finch repeated, his voice suddenly frail, all the bluster gone. "As in Alexander Blackwood?" "The very same," Sarah confirmed. "Evelyn is his only child, his sole heir." She chose to live under her mother's maiden name, Vance, to experience a normal life, to find a partner who would love her for who she was, not for the name she carried. Sarah's eyes met Julian's, her gaze as cold as ice. A regrettable and clearly failed experiment. The truth slammed into Julian with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a lie, it was an entire universe he had been too arrogant and self-absorbed to ever notice. Evelyn, the simple girl. Evelyn, the barista. Evelyn, the domestic anchor holding him steady. It had all been a choice. Her true sacrifice wasn't pawning a locket, it was giving up a life of unimaginable luxury to be with him, to believe in his dream, and he had thrown it all away. He looked at her, then truly looked at her, the woman he had dared to call parasitic, unambitious, and delusional. She remained composed and serene, her face showing not victory, but a profound and deep-seated sadness, the sorrow of a woman who had wagered her heart on a man and suffered the most catastrophic loss imaginable. In that instant, Julian Thorne saw more than just the pathways to the Blackwood fortune. He saw the single greatest error of his existence, the winning lottery ticket he had not merely allowed to escape his grasp. He had ripped it into pieces and hurled it back at the very woman who offered it. Isabella was already subtly shifting her chair away from him, her expression a mixture of horror and cold calculation. She no longer saw a fiancé. She saw the most foolish man on earth. The courtroom was frozen in time, trapped in the aftershock of hearing the name Blackwood. Judge Miller, for her part, recovered her composure with the skilled grace of someone who had witnessed every conceivable human drama. She struck her gavel a single time, the sharp report reverberating through the stunned silence. "Order," she commanded. "Mr. Finch, be seated." "Ms. Jenkins, you have presented a claim that fundamentally alters the nature of these proceedings. You spoke of an executive and of documentation. However, in a case of this extraordinary nature, the court requires more." Marcus Finch, sensing a narrow opening, scrambled to his feet once more. "Precisely, Your Honor. This is mere hearsay. Documents can be falsified. Tales can be fabricated. They must provide more than just a name. They must produce a person. Where is this fabled Alexander Blackwood? Why is he not present to corroborate this absurd narrative?" The point was legitimate. Alexander Blackwood was famously reclusive, a virtual phantom who had not been publicly photographed for more than 20 years. The notion of him materializing in a divorce court in Lower Manhattan was utterly preposterous. Finch was aware of this, and a sliver of his arrogance resurfaced. He was wagering that it was all a ruse, an unbelievably bold one, but a ruse all the same. Sarah Jenkins remained unmoved. She cast a look at the clock on the courtroom wall, then toward the imposing oak doors at the rear. "My client's father is presently on a transoceanic flight and is unreachable. His privacy, as Mr. Finch is well aware, is of the utmost importance. However," she stated, her timing perfect, "we anticipated the court's requirement for direct verification. We have a witness." "A witness?" the judge inquired, her eyebrows arching. "Your witness list was submitted a week ago. It listed only a single name, Evelyn Vance." "This is an unscheduled character and financial witness, Your Honor," Sarah conceded. "But their testimony is crucial to substantiate my client's identity and financial position, a matter that the petitioner's counsel has relentlessly and repeatedly challenged. Under the circumstances, we feel their testimony is indispensable for justice to prevail." Finch was enraged. "Objection! This is a procedural ambush. We have been given no time for preparation, no chance for discovery regarding this mystery witness. It is a total violation of protocol." "Ordinarily, Mr. Finch, I would concur," Judge Miller responded, her tone cutting. "However, you are the one who has spent the last hour depicting Mr. Vance as an impoverished fabricator. You opened this door. You demanded proof. Miss Jenkins is now offering to furnish it. I will permit it." But she cautioned Sarah, "This had better be significant." "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah replied with a deferential nod. She then faced the rear of the courtroom. "The defense calls Arthur Pendleton to the stand." If the name Blackwood was a grenade, then Arthur Pendleton was a precision-guided missile. To the common person, the name was meaningless. But in the rarefied air of global finance and corporate law, the world Julian and Finch occupied, Arthur Pendleton was a legend. He was the chief executive officer of the Blackwood Industries parent company, the public face of an unseen empire. He was Alexander Blackwood's right-hand man, his gatekeeper, and his most trusted advisor for over 30 years. They called him the Viceroy. Julian's blood turned to ice. He had witnessed Pendleton speak once at a Davos summit, for which he had paid a fortune to attend. The man radiated an aura of quiet, unassailable power that made audacious new money figures like Julian feel like mere children. The very thought of Arthur Pendleton entering this courtroom to support Evelyn was inconceivable. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open. Two men in dark, severe suits stepped inside first, their eyes surveying the room with practiced efficiency. They were unmistakably security. And then, between them, walked Arthur Pendleton. He was in his late 60s, tall and lean, with a full head of silver hair and eyes the shade of a winter sky. He was not attired in the flamboyant style of lawyers like Finch. He wore a simple, perfectly tailored gray suit, a white shirt, and a dark blue tie. His attire did not scream wealth. It murmured it from a vast and unreachable distance. He proceeded with a calm, measured pace down the center aisle, his gaze locked straight ahead. The entire room appeared to hold its breath as the very air crackled with his presence. He moved past Julian's table without the slightest hint of recognition. Julian felt an uncontrollable impulse to shrink in his chair, to vanish entirely. Pendleton's mere presence in this room served as a verdict on Julian's life, a judgment far more powerful than any the judge could ever pronounce. He had not simply divorced a woman, he had offended an empire. Arthur Pendleton arrived at the witness stand and stood patiently, awaiting the oath. He glanced at Evelyn, and for one brief, fleeting moment, his stern countenance softened into an expression of fatherly affection and concern. It was a glance that affirmed everything. Marcus Finch collapsed into his chair, his face pale as ash. All the fight had drained from him. He was a shark, certainly, but he had just realized he was swimming in an ocean owned by a blue whale, and he had committed the fatal error of attempting to take a bite. Isabella Sterling slowly and deliberately retrieved her crocodile leather handbag from the floor. She set it on her lap and unclasped it, her motions exact and robotic. She was no longer looking at anyone. She was plotting her exit. The merger was dead. The court clerk, a man who had witnessed decades of ordinary conflicts, faltered slightly as he administered the oath to Arthur Pendleton. The witness's silent authority seemed to unsettle even him. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," Pendleton answered, his voice composed and distinct, carrying effortlessly across the silent room. Sarah Jenkins approached the stand. "Mr. Pendleton, would you please state your full name and occupation for the record?" "My name is Arthur Hemmings Pendleton. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Blackwood Global Industries." Each word was articulated with precision, a declaration of undeniable fact. "And in what capacity are you acquainted with my client, Ms. Evelyn Vance?" Pendleton shifted his gaze slightly toward Evelyn, a fond, almost melancholy smile gracing his lips for a moment. "I have known Evelyn since the day she was born. I am her godfather, and I am the executor of her family's trust." Sarah nodded. "Can you confirm for the court her relationship to your employer, Mr. Alexander Blackwood?" "Evelyn is Mr. Blackwood's only child and sole heir," Pendleton stated plainly. "Her legal name is Evelyn Vance Blackwood. Vance was her mother's maiden name. Following her mother's passing and upon reaching adulthood, Evelyn made the personal choice to use the name Vance exclusively in her public life. It was a decision stemming from a desire for privacy and normalcy, a choice her father, while perhaps not fully comprehending it, reluctantly respected. Finch, watching his career flash before his eyes, knew he had to do something. Anything. He feebly got to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor, this is all quite touching, but it is not pertinent to the division of marital assets." Judge Miller shot him a glare. "Mr. Finch, you dedicated the better part of an hour to arguing that Ms. Vance's financial standing was zero, and that her character was that of a common swindler. This testimony directly addresses both of those claims." Overruled. "Sit down." Finch sat, his face flushed with humiliation. Sarah proceeded. "Mr. Pendleton, we have submitted an inventory of 3 specific items: a Basquiat painting, a Patek Philippe watch, and a series of bearer bonds, which my client asserts are her personal, non-marital property. Are you able to speak to the authenticity of these claims?" "I most certainly can," Pendleton affirmed. "The Basquiat, untitled cadmium, was acquired by Mr. Blackwood at a Sotheby's auction in 2015. It was a present for Evelyn's 18th birthday. I personally supervised the acquisition and the drafting of the deed of gift. It is her sole property. Its most recent appraisal valued it at $17 million. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. $17 million for a single painting. Julian felt lightheaded. The figures were so immense, they were nearly incomprehensible. He recalled that painting. It had been displayed above their sofa. He had always considered it a chaotic, unsightly mess. He had once quipped about substituting it with something more calming. Evelyn had merely given him a peculiar, sad look and redirected the conversation. "The Patek Philippe," Pendleton continued, his tone as level as if he were reciting a grocery list, "was also a gift, from myself actually, for her graduation from Columbia University. It is one of only 7 in existence. Its value is approximately $3.5 million. Julian's mind was reeling. Columbia. Evelyn had told him she possessed a simple state college degree. It was another fabrication, a lie designed to make herself appear smaller, less formidable, more akin to him. The sheer generosity of her deception was, in its own way, more shattering than the wealth itself. "And the bearer bonds?" Sarah prompted. Those were placed in a trust for Evelyn by her late mother, Catherine Vance Blackwood. They were meant as an emergency fund for Evelyn, to be held completely separate from the Blackwood family finances in order to provide her with a degree of independence. I can confirm their face value is $10 million. All of these assets predate her marriage to Mr. Thorne by a number of years. They are, without question, her personal property. Pendleton paused, then moved his gaze, fixing Julian Thorne with a look as cold and sharp as a sliver of ice. Your Honor, if I might add a personal observation, Pendleton said, his voice acquiring a harder edge. For the past 6 years, I have observed Evelyn live a life of profound humility. She did so to test a theory that she could find a partner who would value her spirit, her intellect, and her heart above everything else. She consciously concealed a personal fortune that utterly dwarfs Mr. Thorne's entire corporate empire, not from a place of deceit, but from a place of hope. She subjected herself to grueling, thankless thoughts, not out of necessity, but to wholeheartedly support the man she loved, to allow his precious dream to flourish. She poured every dollar she earned and every ounce of her life's energy into their partnership. He allowed the weight of those words to settle in the silent courtroom. The accusation I was met with upon entering this courtroom, that she was a parasite, an anchor, a woman utterly devoid of ambition, is not merely a grotesque falsehood, but it is the single greatest misjudgment of character I have ever had the misfortune to witness in my 68 years. Mr. Thorne did not have a leech for a wife. He had a benefactor of unimaginable, selfless generosity. He was a man who was handed the very keys to a kingdom, and instead of entering, he complained about the weight of those keys and then cast them aside for a handful of shiny, worthless pebbles. The metaphor, delivered in Pendleton's devastatingly calm and measured voice, was brutal. It stripped Julian Thorne bare, exposing the shallow depths of his ambition and his catastrophic lack of perception for the entire world to see. Isabella Sterling had heard more than enough. Quietly, without sparing a single word for Julian, she rose to her feet. She smoothed down the fabric of her dress, collected her purse, and with the regal posture of a queen abandoning a fallen state, she turned. She walked with calm, measured steps out of the courtroom. The soft, definitive click of the door closing behind her was the very sound of Julian Thorne's future coming to an end. Julian did not watch her leave. He couldn't tear his gaze away from Evelyn. She was looking at Pendleton, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, not of sadness, but of profound, overwhelming gratitude. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, someone had finally spoken the truth. Someone had truly seen her. I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor, Sarah Jenkins stated, her voice firm as she returned to her seat. Judge Miller turned her attention to the shell-shocked Marcus Finch. Mr. Finch, you may begin your cross-examination. Finch stared at Pendleton, who met his gaze with an unnerving, unshakable calm. To cross-examine the viceroy of the Blackwood Empire would be nothing short of professional suicide. No, Your Honor, Finch mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. No questions. Judge Miller surveyed the wreckage of the scene before her. The petitioner's side was in complete disarray. Julian Thorne sat utterly alone, a man hollowed out, the very architecture of his arrogance having collapsed in on itself. His lawyer, Marcus Finch, was aimlessly shuffling papers, his actions devoid of purpose, his eyes avoiding contact with everyone in the room. The respondent's side, by stark contrast, was a bastion of quiet, unshakable strength. Well, the judge said, her voice laced with an irony so dry it could ignite a fire, this has certainly been an illuminating morning. The court finds the testimony of Mr. Pendleton to be both credible and compelling. She fixed her piercing gaze directly on Julian. Mr. Thorne, your petition to deny spousal support is, of course, granted, as the respondent has graciously withdrawn her request. As for the matter of personal assets, Ms. Jenkins, has your client made the necessary arrangements to retrieve her property? We have, Your Honor, Sarah confirmed with confidence. Mr. Pendleton's security team is on standby. We request a court order granting my client immediate and exclusive access to the residence at 113 Central Park West for a period of 2 hours to retrieve her personal belongings. So ordered, the judge declared, banging her gavel. The sound felt less like a closing and more like the final nail being hammered into the coffin of Julian's life. And as for the petitioner's generous offer of a $5,000 settlement, she paused, looking at Julian with a look of utter disdain. The court dismisses that offer as insulting, made in bad faith, and based on a complete and willful misrepresentation of the facts. This proceeding is concluded. The gavel fell one last time. It was truly over. As people began to stir, a muted buzz of shocked gossip filling the cavernous room, Arthur Pendleton stepped down from the witness stand. He walked directly to the defense table and placed a gentle, reassuring hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and suffused with kindness. Evelyn finally looked up at him, a single tear tracing a path of liberation down her cheek. She nodded, managing to conjure a small, watery smile. "Thank you, Arthur, for everything." "Alexander wanted to come himself," Pendleton admitted with a slight smile. "I had to talk him out of it. He would have purchased the courthouse and had it demolished with Mr. Thorne still inside." Despite everything, a small, genuine laugh escaped Evelyn's lips. It felt like the first ray of sunshine breaking through after a long and unforgiving storm. She stood, and for the first time that day, she squared her shoulders and looked directly across the aisle at the man who had been her husband. Julian was staring at her, his face a pathetic mask of pure desperation and dawning horror. As she began to walk away, flanked by Pendleton and her lawyer, he finally snapped out of his trance. "Ellie," he called out, his voice cracking with a desperate plea. He stumbled from his chair, rushing to intercept her before she could reach the aisle. "Ellie, wait. We need to talk." Pendleton's security men moved instantly, stepping between Julian and Evelyn, forming a silent, immovable human wall. "Please," Julian begged, his voice pleading, his eyes wild with a torrent of regret. "I didn't know. I swear to you I had no idea. I made a mistake. A terrible, stupid mistake." Evelyn stopped. She looked at him, not over the shoulders of the security guards, but by stepping slightly to the side, meeting his frantic gaze directly. The look in her eyes was not one of anger or of hatred. It was something far, far worse, pity. It was the look one gives to something utterly broken and insignificant. "You're right, Julian," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying effortlessly in the now silent courtroom. "You did make a mistake. But your mistake wasn't leaving me, and it wasn't not knowing about my family." She took a deliberate step closer, forcing him to absorb the profound truth of her words. "Your mistake was believing that a person's worth is measured by their bank account. You mocked me for being a barista, a librarian. You were ashamed of me because I wasn't a CEO or a celebrated socialite. You didn't see any value in kindness or loyalty or sacrifice unless it directly served your own ambition." She let the silence hang in the air for a moment. "The money doesn't change who I am. I'm still the woman who served coffee to support you. I'm still the woman who sold her own mother's locket for you. The only thing that has changed is that now you see that woman as valuable. And that, Julian, is why we are over. You didn't fall in love with Evelyn Vance, and you certainly do not deserve Evelyn Blackwood." With that final, devastating pronouncement, she turned her back on him. She did not look back as she walked out of the courtroom, Arthur Pendleton at her side, leaving Julian Thorne standing utterly alone in the ruins of his own making, a desperately poor man who had, for a brief, shining moment, held all the wealth in the world in his hands and had been too blind to see it. The news of the courtroom drama spread through New York's elite circles like wildfire. The story was simply too delicious. The meteoric rise and the even more spectacular self-destruction of Julian Thorne. His firm, Thorne Capital, imploded within a single week. Investors, spooked by his catastrophic lack of judgment, pulled their money out in a panicked exodus. His reputation as a brilliant visionary was obliterated, replaced by a new damning one. He was the fool who divorced the Blackwood heiress. No one wanted to do business with a man who couldn't recognize a billion-dollar asset when he was married to it. He lost the condo, his business, and what few real friends he ever had. He tried calling Evelyn hundreds of times, but the calls went unanswered, echoing into a void of his own creation. He became a pariah, a walking cautionary tale whispered about at galas and in boardrooms. The shiny pebbles he had chosen, Isabella's status, a fleeting sense of superiority, had all crumbled to dust in his hands. 3 months passed. To the gossiping circles of New York's elite, the story of Julian Thorne's downfall had been a thrilling but fleeting drama. He was yesterday's news, a cautionary tale that had already been replaced by newer, more titillating scandals. Evelyn Vance Blackwood had simply vanished, retreating behind the impenetrable walls that the Blackwood name afforded. Many assumed she had simply returned to a life of quiet, reclusive luxury, the brief, messy chapter of her public life now permanently closed. They were profoundly wrong. The bombshell dropped not in a vapid society column, but on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The headline was stark, printed in bold, uncompromising ink. Blackwood heiress launches $500 million Vance Foundation for Educational and Arts Access. Beneath it was a photograph of Evelyn, taken at a press conference held not in some sterile corporate ballroom, but in the majestic, book-lined hall of the New York Public Library. She looked completely transformed. The timid, haunted woman from the courtroom was gone, replaced by a leader. She was dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored navy blue dress, her hair cut in a sharp professional bob. There was no ostentatious jewelry, only the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who had finally found her power. Her eyes, once downcast and uncertain, were now clear, focused, and held a fire that no one, least of all Julian, had ever seen before. The launch of the Vance Foundation was a meticulously planned statement. The guest list was not a Rolodex of Wall Street titans and vapid socialites. It was composed of university presidents, celebrated poets, struggling playwrights, community organizers, and dedicated public school teachers. It was a room full of the very people Julian's world considered utterly insignificant. Her speech, delivered without a single note, was a masterpiece of grace and purpose. "For a portion of my life," she began, her voice steady and resonant, "I chose to live under my mother's name, Vance. She was a librarian. My father, a man of industry, built empires of steel and commerce. But my mother," she continued, "built empires of the mind. She believed that access to knowledge, to art, to beauty was not a luxury, but a fundamental human right. She taught me that a person's true net worth isn't found on a balance sheet, but in the richness of their curiosity and the depth of their empathy." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the rapt audience. "The world has enough foundations dedicated to building bigger buildings. This foundation is dedicated to building bigger minds. The Vance Foundation will be dedicated to ensuring that the next great novelist isn't lost because her local library closed down, that the next scientific genius isn't overlooked because he couldn't afford tuition, and that the value of a quiet life dedicated to knowledge is celebrated, not mocked." That final statement was a subtle, perfectly aimed barb, and its message was piercingly clear. This was not a gesture of charity, it was a declaration of new principles. In a subsequent, exclusive one-on-one interview with a prominent journalist, the question that was on everyone's mind finally surfaced. "Your story has completely captivated the public," the interviewer began softly. "Many perceive what has befallen your ex-husband as a form of cosmic retribution. Do you?" Evelyn's smile was contemplative, entirely free of malice. "I have no interest in revenge. Revenge is a conversation with the past, and I am far more focused on building the future. What transpired in that courtroom was never about punishing Julian. It was about my own liberation. For years, I permitted another person to define my worth, to write my story for me. I made myself smaller to make him feel bigger, believing that was the essence of love, and support. My greatest error was thinking my value could be diminished by someone else's judgment." She leaned forward, her conviction almost tangible. "My father's name, Blackwood, gives me the resources for this work. It is a tool and a powerful one. But my mother's name, Vance, gives me the mission. This foundation is my voice. It serves as a testament to the belief that true strength is not measured by what you can acquire, but by what you can give. My story isn't about a secret heiress. It's about a librarian's daughter finally putting her mother's lessons into practice." Far across the city, in a dimly lit Queen's bar saturated with the scent of stale beer and regret, Julian Thorne watched the interview on a flickering television above the counter. He nursed a cheap whiskey, its amber warmth doing nothing to soothe the perpetual ache in his soul. He had lost everything. His firm was a hollowed-out, bankrupt shell. His condominium sold to cover his debts, and his name had become a cautionary punchline. He wore a frayed shirt, his face unshaven, a mere ghost of the Tom Ford-clad titan he once was. As Evelyn spoke, each word was a fresh torment. A librarian's daughter. He remembered scoffing at her mother's profession, at the very idea of a quiet life. He remembered calling her unambitious. He saw the very sculpture he'd dismissed as an ugly mess, now the celebrated cornerstone of a museum exhibit funded by her foundation. He saw the brilliant, kind, and profoundly wealthy woman he had discarded for a shallow socialite who had not returned a single one of his desperate calls. He hadn't merely misjudged her financial standing. He had fundamentally misunderstood the very nature of value itself. His ambition had been a raging inferno, providing a brief, brilliant light before consuming him utterly, leaving nothing but cold ash. He finally understood. He hadn't just lost a fortune, he had lost an entire universe. Evelyn, however, was miles away, with no thought of him at all. The interview was finished. The galas and press conferences concluded for the day. She was at a small, underfunded community library in the Bronx, one of the first recipients of a Vance grant. There were no cameras here. She sat on a low stool in the children's section, reading a storybook to a small group of wide-eyed children. In this quiet, unassuming space, surrounded by the scent of old paper and burgeoning imagination, she was truly home. She was not Evelyn Blackwood, the heiress, nor was she Evelyn Vance, the ridiculed ex-wife. She was simply Evelyn, a woman who had walked through fire and emerged not hardened, but illuminated, at last building an empire of her own. One book, one mind, and one quiet act of kindness at a time. Evelyn's journey was never just about revealing a secret identity. It was about unveiling her true self, a self she had kept hidden even from herself. She entered that courtroom a victim and walked out a victor, not because of her wealth, but because she had finally reclaimed her own narrative. It is a powerful reminder that our worth is never determined by another's opinion or their failure to see our value. It is defined by our own integrity, our kindness, and the strength to stand in our truth. What do you believe was Julian's greatest mistake? Was it his greed, his arrogance, or his simple inability to appreciate the extraordinary person right in front of him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by Evelyn's story of humiliation and ultimate triumph, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribing to the channel for more powerful real-life stories. Your support helps us continue to bring these incredible journeys to light. Thank you for watching.